It grows worse, Your Majesty. I fear the humors are unbalanced.
Just drain the poison, man.
When people speak of the most terrifying kings in history, they picture wild-eyed tyrants with bloodied swords and towers filled with severed heads. Few would imagine that one of England's most dangerous and unpredictable rulers began as a handsome golden boy, a charming prince who could sing, compose music, joust like a champion, and make even the Pope proud. Henry VIII was not born a monster. He was born to love, to be loved, and to rule. But piece by piece, something inside him began to rot a bruise, spreading beneath royal silk, until the man who once danced through palaces became a king who needed a crane to lift his body onto a horse. Henry was never meant to wear the crown. His older brother, Arthur, was trained to be king. When Arthur died young, he left behind both his throne and his widow, Catherine of Aragon. The church permitted young Henry to marry her, and in the year 1509, a new reign began. He was radiant tall, athletic, and blessed with the kind of beauty that made ambassadors write poems about his calves. The kingdom adored him. He hunted. He sang. He played tennis. He wrote songs that still echo through the centuries. England saw in him a golden age waiting to happen, but one dream devoured him from within the dream of a son. Catherine gave birth several times, but the children either died young or were never born alive. Only one survived, a daughter, Mary. Henry convinced himself that God was punishing him for marrying his brother's widow. Every cradle that remained empty whispered a curse in his ear. And then came Anne Boleyn. She was clever, confident, and refused to be just another mistress. She wanted a crown. He wanted her. Together, they burned down the world. To have Anne, Henry broke England away from Rome, rejected the Pope's authority, and declared himself the head of a brand new church. It was the most dangerous love affair in European history. But the dream that began in passion ended in screams. Anne gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth, not the son Henry had demanded. She miscarried again and again, and the king's affection turned to suspicion. Courtiers whispered poison into his ear until he believed his queen had betrayed him with her own brother. Within weeks, Anne was arrested, tried for adultery and treason, and beheaded in the Tower of London. The sword was sharp, the executioner French, a final act of royal mercy. They said, on the day her head fell, Henry was already preparing for another wedding. Jane Seymour, wife number 3, gave him the heir he had waited for, Prince Edward. But she died in childbirth, and Henry's grief quickly curdled into hunger. He grew heavier, crueler, impossible to satisfy. By the time he reached middle age, he weighed nearly 400 pounds. His legs were covered in open sores that never healed, oozing infection. The stench from his body was said to carry through 3 rooms. His physicians burned the ulcers with red-hot irons to keep him alive, and he screamed until the walls trembled. When the pain grew unbearable, he signed death warrants. Anne of Cleves, the 4th wife, was divorced because he found her ugly. Catherine Howard, the 5th, was executed for infidelity. Catherine Parr, the 6th, survived him barely. 6 wives, 6 broken lives, and one man at the center of it all, convinced that he was both chosen by God and cursed by fate. Power and sickness became the only companions left in his palace. Even his beloved music fell silent. And yet, out of all that blood, something extraordinary emerged. The daughter he once dismissed, Elizabeth, the child of the witch he killed, rose to become the greatest ruler England would ever know. She reigned for more than 4 decades, transformed her father's broken realm into a global empire, and never married. Perhaps she had seen too well what marriage had done to her mother. Perhaps she knew that love, in her family, always ended with a blade. This was Henry VIII, a king of appetites and agony, who destroyed his wives, his church, and his own body in pursuit of a son, and yet fathered a queen who would outshine them all. When he died in the year 1547, his body was sealed in a lead coffin to contain the smell of decay. But no metal could contain his legend. It lingers still, the story of a man who wanted eternity and left behind only ghosts. He had once been a boy who sang beneath stained glass windows, lifting his voice in Latin hymns, dreaming not of battles or crowns, but of harmony, of something higher, something sacred. The court whispered that young Henry had been destined for the church, that before his brother Arthur died, the red-haired prince had been groomed not for war, but for worship. He was a boy of books, of psalms and philosophy, a boy who rode with elegance, danced with the grace of angels, and laughed like someone who had never been told no. But the throne changes everything. It doesn't ask if you're ready. It simply waits for you to bleed. In those early years, before his soul began to crack under the weight of legacy, Henry was what poets might call golden. He trained like an Olympian, hunted like a god, and filled his court with music. He didn't just listen, he played, he composed. He was a true Renaissance prince, the kind that painters dream of and princesses pray for. He surrounded himself with recorders, lutes. Virginals even boasted of having more than 150 instruments adorned with gold and silver. And if the wind carried across the palace gardens on the right afternoon, you could hear him play, singing with a voice that was neither sharp nor soft, but honest. For a time, he believed in beauty, and for a time, beauty loved him back. But beauty fades, and power, as it always does, begins to rot from the inside. When Henry married Catherine of Aragon, it was not just a political match, it was a gesture of duty, an act of unity between England and Spain. She had once been his brother's bride, but the church had declared her marriage unconsummated, paving the way for her to become queen. Catherine was pious, proud, and fiercely intelligent. She ruled beside him with calm dignity, bore him many children, but none survived, save for one, a daughter, Mary. As the years passed and no male heir came, Henry's disappointment turned to desperation. The court grew cold with expectation. Every time the queen grew heavy with child, prayers echoed through the kingdom. And every time the swaddling cloths were laid aside, empty and blood-stained, something inside Henry hardened. He searched for signs in the stars, in the sermons, in the glinting eyes of his courtiers, for proof that God still favored him. And when no answer came, he turned instead to Anne Boleyn. She was not a great beauty, they said, but there was a fire in her that drew men like moths. She had learned refinement in the courts of France, and behind every glance lay a challenge. She refused to be a mistress. She refused to be tamed. And in her resistance, Henry saw salvation. Anne would give him a son. Anne would rewrite his fate. And so, as love turned to obsession, he began to unmake the world he had once defended. Henry's battle with Rome was not just a quarrel over doctrine, it was the slow and brutal unraveling of centuries. In seeking to annul his marriage to Catherine, he challenged the Pope's authority and branded himself both king and priest. He named Thomas Cranmer as Archbishop of Canterbury and placed a crown upon his own soul. The Church of England was born not from faith, but from longing. It was the shape of a man trying to bend heaven to his will. He married Anne in secret, first in the chill of November, then again in January. Both ceremonies cloaked in whispers and haste. She was already pregnant, and Henry's eyes shone with certainty. This would be the son. This would be the turning of the wheel. And when the time came, as bells rang through London and courtiers gathered in splendor, Anne was crowned with St. Edward's crown, a symbol once reserved only for monarchs themselves. She wore gold-threaded robes. She stood taller than fear. But when the child was born in September, it was a girl, Elizabeth. The disappointment was profound. It hummed beneath every gesture, echoed in every silence. But Henry held fast. Anne remained his queen. For now, he rode with her, hunted with her, laughed with her still. They exchanged gifts, embroidered pillows, miniature ships, jeweled tokens. They watched their daughter grow with cautious hope. Yet with each passing month, the pressure returned. The expectation, the curse. Anne became pregnant again. And again the court held its breath. But the child was lost. Then another stillborn, and as the walls closed in, so did the knives. Henry began to listen to voices that had once been only background noise, men who envied Anne, women who resented her sharp tongue and sharper wit. Rumors began to creep like ivy into the corridors that she was unfaithful, that she bewitched him, that her very body was marked by the devil, with extra fingers and unnatural moles, that she was too proud, too bold, too much. Anne's enemies gathered, chief among them, Thomas Cromwell, a man of ambition and calculation. If Henry wanted freedom, Cromwell would give it to him and dress it in legal language, wrap it in the trappings of justice. Anne was arrested on the 2nd day of May in the year 1536. The charge is adultery, incest, treason. The evidence whispers, tortured confessions, and forged accounts. Among those condemned were Anne's own brother, George Boleyn, and a musician named Mark Smeaton, who confessed, likely under duress, to sins he never committed. She was taken to the Tower of London, the same place she had entered as queen just 3 years earlier. Her final days were a portrait of grace and terror. She denied all charges, wrote to the king in anguish, and joked with her ladies-in-waiting about her slender neck. "I shall be known as Queen Lackhead," she said. And then came the morning of her death, the 19th of May. She wore a grey gown, a red petticoat, and a headdress of English gables. The French swordsman summoned specifically for her knelt beside her and asked forgiveness. She knelt, prayed, and never cried out. One clean stroke, one heartbeat, then silence. 11 days later, Henry married Jane Seymour. There was no mourning, no black banners, only the quiet shuffling of courtiers adjusting their loyalties and the distant cries of a nation trying to remember what love had once felt like. And so the legend grew. The king, who choked his kingdom with laws while his heart bled through marriages, the man who sang love songs by candlelight and signed death warrants before breakfast, the man who changed the religion of a nation not for faith, but for a face, and behind it all, a question that no courtier dared ask aloud. What was Henry truly afraid of? It was not women. He conquered them. It was not Rome. He defied it. It was not God. He rewrote him. It was failure. It was the silence of a nursery with no air. the echo of his brother's name in every empty cradle. The long, dark corridor toward the grave, with no son to carry his name. Henry waged war against that silence with every pound of flesh, every broken vow, every law passed, and every woman sacrificed. And though he tried to feast his way past it, to sing above it, to ride through it with trumpet and blade, the silence only grew louder. And yet, somehow, beneath it all, there was still a child, a girl he had nearly forgotten waiting to rise. And her name was Elizabeth. In the end, it was not an enemy's blade nor a foreign army that began to break Henry apart. It was a horse, a beast he had mounted 1,000 times before. A tournament like so many others. The crowds cheering, the banners flying. But on that day in January of the year, 1536, Fate rode beside him, cloaked in steel. The king entered the lists at Greenwich Palace to joust against Sir Henry Norris. A trusted courtier and friend, what happened next would never be forgotten. The king missed his mark, lost control, and fell. The fully armored horse, startled and massive, reared and crashed down upon him. For 2 hours, he did not move. He did not breathe. And when they dragged his body away, pale and crushed beneath the weight of the beast, everyone thought he was dead. Anne Boleyn. And then pregnant. I heard the news and screamed, so loudly it echoed down the stone halls. The shock was too great. The child within her, perhaps a son, was lost. The miscarriage came like a storm. And when it was over, Anne lay in silence, mourning both her baby and the future slipping from her grasp. Henry awoke. But something inside him did not. That fall changed him. The man who rose from the sickbed weeks later was not the same one who had once sung lullabies to his unborn heir. The pain in his legs never truly left him. Beneath his stockings, slow rot had begun to claim his flesh. At first, he tried to ignore it. But as months passed, the ulcers grew open, wounds that oozed and refused to heal. And with them came anger, paranoia, and an increasingly foul stench that no incense could mask. His moods turned black. The laughter disappeared from the feasts. The music quieted. Courtiers began to whisper in corners about the king's legs, his swelling belly, his isolation. But to speak openly was dangerous. It had become treasonous to mention the king's body, to acknowledge the decline of a man who still insisted on being treated as divine. His pain, however, was no longer a secret. It walked into the room before he did. The ulcers were just the beginning, with limited understanding of infection. Henry's doctors could do little more than lance and cauterize. They burned the sores with hot irons and applied poultices of wine, honey, and herbs. They wrapped his legs in bandages and prayed the flesh would not blacken further. But it did. The stench was so potent that some claimed they could smell his wounds from 3 chambers away. He could no longer climb stairs unaided, no longer ride without a mechanical hoist. The king, once a vision of masculinity and motion, had become a creature of chairs and shadows. And yet, pride made him insist on appearances. He wore doublets lined with velvet, cloaks embroidered with gold, and wide skirts to hide his bulk. But beneath the layers, the truth festered. His waist had grown to over 50 inches. His weight surpassed 300 pounds. And still, he ate. The royal menus were grotesque in scale. Platters of game birds, haunches of venison, pies thick with lard, sweets made of cream and almond and sugar imported from the colonies. He drank deeply, wine and ale and mead, often consuming up to 20 pints a day. And as his body expanded, so too did the silence around him. No one dared tell the king that he was dying from the inside out. His rage, once theatrical, and became dangerous. Men and women he had once trusted began to vanish. Some were imprisoned. Others were executed. One wrong look, one careless word about his condition, and heads would roll. Henry Courtenay and Henry Pole, both cousins of the king, were accused of treason in whispers and dragged to the block. Their crime, allegedly saying aloud what everyone already knew, that the king's leg would kill him. The court learned to smile through fear, to toast their ruler with shaking hands. His chamber was filled with doctors, but none could cure him. They bled him, blistered him, purged him, and still the ulcers spread, and though he no longer trusted anyone, he allowed them to touch him, cut him, burn him, because even kings are afraid to die. But it was not just Henry's body that deteriorated. His mind, too, began to fracture. Some days, he raged like a wild animal. Other days, he wept alone, his skin waxen and damp. He spoke to portraits of lost wives. He demanded that court musicians play the same mournful melody for hours. He ordered his servants to coat his chamber in rosewater and cover the mirrors so he wouldn't have to see his own face. And sometimes, in the middle of the night, he whispered to God, begging, bargaining, cursing. The leg wounds turned septic more than once, sending him into fevered rants. At those moments, he became convinced he was being poisoned by his enemies, his physicians, even his own children. He rotated guards. He changed chambers. He had food tasted 3 times before it passed his lips. And when the illness broke, he would forget, or pretend to, but the fear never left his eyes. Jane Seymour had died years before, leaving him the son he had longed for, Edward, the fragile boy who was his only male heir. But Edward was sickly, pale, and often bedridden. Henry's hope was a flickering candle in a storm, and with every passing year, it became harder to believe that his line would survive. Elizabeth and Mary, daughters from discarded queens, remained in the shadows, tolerated but never truly trusted. He surrounded himself with yes-men: Thomas Howard, Stephen Gardiner, Richard rich men, who bowed low and said whatever he wanted to hear. They spoke of loyalty, of legacy, of divine right. But they all smelled the same stench rising from beneath the king's robes. They all knew that the Tudor star was dimming, and that when it finally went dark, England would be thrown into chaos. By the year 1546, Henry could barely move. His legs were swaddled in linen and herbs. His food had to be brought to him in bed. He wore armor only ceremonially. And even then, it had to be custom forged to accommodate his massive frame. His eyes were yellowed. His breath was shallow. The once golden boy of Europe now resembled something out of legend, a wounded lion gnawing its own paws. Caged in velvet and fear, he still called himself defender of the faith, though the church he created now served more to justify his desires than his doctrines. He still invoked God's will when signing death warrants, and when he looked at his son, he saw both triumph and doom. For Edward, though crowned, would never see adulthood. But Henry could not know that yet. For now, he clung to the illusion that he had won, that despite everything, he had bent the world to his will, that the crown would outlast the decay, that the music he once played would be remembered more than the screams, that his soul would not rot the way his flesh had. And still, as winter deepened and the pain returned, the king whispered only one name in his darkest hours: not Jane, not Catherine, not even Edward. He whispered Elizabeth, There are certain things the body remembers, even after the mind has tried to forget. The scent of lavender oil used to clean a wound, the icy sting of a cauterizing iron, the silence between screams. Henry, once a man of fire and appetite, now lived by the rhythm of pain. Morning meant bleeding. Noon meant burning. Night meant dreaming of legs that still worked. A body that still danced. A wife who still looked at him without fear. But the dreams never lasted. Not when his flesh betrayed him every time he tried to stand. By the final winter of his reign, Henry had become a man hidden behind curtains. His bedchamber at Whitehall was dark. The windows shuttered even at noon. The smell of herbs, rot, and sweat thickened the air, until even the courtiers who had once fought to serve him began to avoid the room. He could no longer bear the weight of his own body. His skin had gone gray. His eyes turned glassy. The ulcers, those old and faithful enemies, had opened again. Deeper this time, as if they too were ready for the end. But death was not what Henry feared. Not really. He feared being forgotten. He feared that everything he had broken, the church, the court, the country, had been shattered for nothing. That he had spilled oceans of blood and sacrificed 6 women not for legacy, but for noise, and the noise was fading. He had written once, in a moment of clarity, that he desired peace in his final days. But peace had long fled from him. The weight of his crown was now less than the weight of his regrets. And he had many. Some wore veils and perfumes. Some wore chains and black hoods. Some were buried in velvet coffins. Others haunted the halls of Whitehall, whispering his name in a voice that only he could hear. The pain in his legs was no longer confined to his calves. It spread up his thighs, into his hips, into the marrow of his bones. There were days when he could not sit without crying out. His meals, once lavish and full of spectacle, and had to be chewed for him. His clothes had to be custom-made to wrap around his swelling belly and the abscesses beneath it. His own reflection had become unbearable. He ordered the mirrors removed from his chamber. He could not stomach the sight of the thing he had become, the swollen ruin of a boy who once rode like the wind and sang like the morning. He gave orders from his bed now. The great canopy of crimson and gold, shadowing a face drained of color. His voice had changed to lower, slower, trembling with phlegm and bitterness. But when he commanded, people still obeyed. Fear can outlive strength. His court still bowed, and still kissed his ring, still swore loyalty with cracked voices and eyes fixed low. But when they left the room, they whispered. And when they whispered, they talked of the smell. 3 rooms away. They said, that's how far the scent of his legs could travel. That's how thick the pus had become. How deep the infections had bored into him. They changed the bandages daily, sometimes twice, and still it leaked. No one dared say gangrene, but all of them thought it. No one dared mention amputation. The king would not survive it, and no surgeon would survive the attempt. So they burned him. They pressed metal to his skin and prayed that pain was still enough to hold back the rot. But the pain was never enough. At night, the king sometimes called out for Jane, sometimes for Anne, sometimes for his mother. The names blurred together in his throat. He'd wake trembling, whispering apologies no one dared ask about. He would grasp the hand of a servant and ask, over and over, if they thought he had been a good king. Not a great one. He no longer dreamed of greatness, but merely good. No one ever answered truthfully, even as he decayed. Henry could not stop eating. It was not hunger that drove him anymore, but habit. The chewing, the swallowing, the wine between courses. It was all ritual now. A way to prove that he was still here. And still breathing. Still ruling. He once ordered an entire menu written down for the afterlife. 20 courses. Ranging from roasted swan to sugared almonds to barrels of red wine. As if he could bribe the angels with goose fat and candied pears. Perhaps he believed heaven had a court too. And he would sit at its head. Glutted and grinning. But there were fewer courtiers at his table now. The nobles had begun to plan for what came after. Prince Edward, young, sickly, watchful, was being guarded more heavily. Elizabeth and Mary, once bastardized and exiled, were now names spoken in strategy rooms. The great lords looked to one another not with loyalty but calculation. Henry was no longer the center of gravity. He was a sinking sun, and they were already turning toward the next dawn. Still, the king endured. He dictated letters. He signed laws. He had his armor widened one final time. Though he would never wear it again. He planned his tomb grand. Immense. Built to rival that of any emperor. He commissioned carvings of himself in marble. Wrapped in robes of eternal youth. He left instructions for music to be played eternally over his grave. He did not know that the organ would fall silent within a generation. The tomb left unfinished. Forgotten, in a shadowed corner of Windsor. On the final night of his life, Henry was said to have asked for a candle. Not for light, but for warmth. The fire in his bones had gone out, and as he lay in the great bed that had once held queens and lovers and enemies alike, his breath grew shallow. No final speech. No great roar. Just a slow, wheezing sigh. And then, silence. He died in the early hours of January, the 28th, in the year 1547. At the age of 55, his body, swollen and splitting at the seams, was placed in a coffin lined with lead to contain the smell. Even in death, his flesh betrayed him. The wooden box reportedly cracked, and black fluid leaked onto the floor of the chapel where his remains were temporarily laid. A priest slipped and fell in it. No procession could hide the truth. The Golden King had rotted from within. But even then, the story was not over. For behind the heavy door of her chamber, a red-haired girl waited. Quiet. Watching. Listening. Her name had been written off. Her future discarded. But with her father's final breath, a path opened before her. And she, the daughter of the executed queen, the bastard once forgotten, would rise. She would not weep for him. She would outlive him. She would become what he never was. A ruler made not of fire, but of iron. When a man builds his kingdom on sons, what happens when only daughters remain? The body of Henry was barely cold when they crowned his only legitimate son, Edward, son of Jane Seymour, barely 9 years old. Still pale. Still coughing. Still clutching at the hand of his tutors, and staring wide-eyed at the court that had already begun, dividing itself between those who would serve him and those who would survive him. He had his father's eyes, they said, his mother's quiet grace, but no strength. No army of siblings behind him. No full-grown protector to hold the crown steady on his head. What he had instead was the heavy silence of expectation, and the shadows of two sisters watching from the edge of everything. Mary, the eldest, was daughter of the first queen, the long-suffering Catherine of Aragon. She had seen more loss than most women, thrice her age. She had watched her mother banished, her title stripped, her legitimacy questioned by every courtier who ever bowed before her. She had knelt through masses, praying for God to return her dignity. She had stared down servants who once called her princess and now called her nothing at all. When her father died, she did not weep. When her brother rose, she curtsied. Not out of loyalty, but necessity. A woman alone at court was not a woman who could afford pride. Elizabeth, the younger, was different. She was born of scandal, raised in shadows. She bore her mother's dark eyes and her father's cleverness. But unlike them, she spoke rarely and listened always. She had learned early what silence could protect. After all, her mother, Anne Boleyn, had died before Elizabeth was 3 years old. And yet the story of that sword at the Tower was stitched into every glance she received. People remembered. They always remembered. She was the child of ambition, seduction, heresy, and blood. A girl too smart, too observant, too close to the throne. And so she learned not to ask for anything. She watched. She learned. She waited. And above them both sat Edward. Young, educated, controlled by regents who bled the kingdom dry, while the boy's health withered in silence. His reign was brief. His victories minor. He issued Protestant reforms. Yes, but none of them could shield him from the coughing fits that racked his body, nor the deep fevers that came in waves, nor the wasting that made his royal robes fall from his shoulders like drapes from a withered frame. By the summer of the year 1553, he was barely breathing, and by July, he was dead. The crown that Henry had fought for, killed for, had passed from the boy's skull after only 6 years. And now, 2 women remained. But power, once grasped, is never passed down without a fight. In his final weeks, Edward had been persuaded to name Lady Jane Grey, his Protestant cousin, as his successor. She was young, intelligent, and devout. And most importantly, she was not merry. But she was also unprepared. And so when the boy king died, Jane was thrust onto the throne, crowned in a hush, her face pale, her voice trembling. They called her the 9 Days Queen, though the title might have been better called a sentence, because Mary, the daughter who had once wept at her mother's banishment, was not silent anymore. She rode to London with banners flying, soldiers marching, and the Catholic cross raised high once more. The people, tired of chaos, tired of scheming councils, greeted her with cheers. Jane was imprisoned. Mary was crowned. The daughter of the discarded queen stood now on her father's throne. And for a brief moment, it seemed as if everything Catherine had suffered had not been in vain. But vengeance is not the same as peace. Mary, now queen, ruled with a fire that had been stoked in exile. She turned England back toward Rome, ordered the restoration of Catholicism, and began the burnings. Protestants who refused to recant were dragged into public squares, tied to stakes, and set alight. Heretics. They called them enemies of God. But behind every flame was a memory of her mother's tears, of her own humiliation, of the siblings and courtiers who had once turned their backs. And Elizabeth bent the knee. She said the words required of her, attended mass, swore loyalty. And every day she survived. She watched from the edge of court, her face composed, her thoughts unreadable. She walked the halls where her mother had danced, past the stone archways where Anne Boleyn had once laughed, and never spoke her name. But the blood of Anne still beat beneath Elizabeth's skin. She knew what happened to women who rose too fast. She knew how quickly a smile could turn into an accusation, and when, in the year 1554, a rebellion broke out in England. Mary's advisors looked not to foreign invaders, but to Elizabeth, the next Protestant in line, a woman of intelligence, of ambition, of quiet power. They dragged her to the Tower of London, the same place her mother had died. For weeks, Elizabeth waited in that cold chamber, listening to the crows outside and the guards below. She knew what happened in the tower. She had read it in history, smelled it in the damp stone. Her bones remembered what her mother had never had time to explain. The chopping block, the blindfold, the silence that follows the thud. But the blade never came. Perhaps Mary pitied her. Perhaps she believed the girl innocent. Perhaps she feared turning her sister into a martyr. Whatever the reason, Elizabeth was eventually released. But she was changed. And the kingdom was changing. 2. Mary's marriage to Philip of Spain was hated. Her phantom pregnancies became public humiliation. Her burnings earned her a name that history would not forget, Bloody Mary. And as her health declined, as her vision dimmed, and her stomach swelled with nothing but air, one truth became clear: she would die, childless. In her final days, she called for Elizabeth. She named her heir. And when Mary died, in the year 1558, the daughter of Anne Boleyn walked calmly to the throne of England. No wars, no fire, no blood spilled that day. Only the sound of footsteps, and the return of red hair to the crown. She was 25 years old when they placed the crown upon her head, the daughter of a mother beheaded. The child once branded a bastard. The girl whose every breath had once been an inconvenience to kings, and yet now, in the chill morning of January the 15th, in the year 1559, Elizabeth Tudor stood tall beneath the ancient arches of Westminster Abbey, draped in gold, crowned not only with jewels, but with something far heavier: survival. She did not weep. She did not stumble. And though her lips formed the prayers, her eyes never closed. Elizabeth had learned long ago never to look away. Not from swords, not from betrayal, not even from God. The crown fit her head like it had been waiting. And perhaps it had. The England she inherited was no longer a country. It was a battlefield of ghosts. Her father had torn it in half to chase a son. Her brother had tried to reform it. Her sister had tried to set it aflame. Now it was her turn. And she knew better than most that England did not forgive easily. It remembered. It bled for its queens. And sometimes, it bled them dry. But Elizabeth was not her father, nor her brother, nor her sister. She would not chase power with fire or fury. She would not drown the nation in doctrine. She would not declare war on the papacy, nor bend the knee to Rome. What she would do was watch, and wait, and listen to every whisper before speaking, because that, she knew, was how women survived. In the first months of her reign, she kept her court small and her gaze wide. She allowed the Catholic bishops to keep their posts for now. She sent kind letters to foreign rulers, not pledging allegiance, but promising calm. She summoned the best minds of her day not to dominate them, but to learn. She reopened Parliament with careful language, avoiding both Protestant provocation and Catholic panic. And behind her calm voice, behind the bright silks and the painted smile, there was always calculation. She walked the palace gardens at dawn, always alone, memorizing the patterns of the hedges and the faces of the guards. She met with her advisors by candlelight, testing their loyalties with small lies. She ate little, I drank less, and slept with one eye open. The bed of a queen was never empty, not with lovers, but with knives. And yet, Despite her caution, the court could not stop talking. Who would she marry? What prince would take her hand? What foreign king would claim her bed? A woman on the throne was a political question, a walking alliance, a womb wrapped in velvet. Every ambassador wanted an answer. Every nobleman dreamed of the power her wedding would bring. But Elizabeth remained silent. She gave them smiles, riddles, and charm. She accepted gifts, flattery, poems, and proposals. And then she refused every single one. They called her the Virgin Queen, not knowing that her refusal was not chastity, but strategy. Because Elizabeth had watched what marriage had done to women. She had seen her mother discarded, her sister humiliated. Queens turned into breeders, wives turned into corpses. She would not be ruled by a husband. She would not give her enemies a king to use against her. I am already married, she once said, to England. And England, bruised and bleeding, leaned in to listen. Still, it was not all strategy in stone. There were moments of warmth. She had favorites, and they knew it. Robert Dudley, her childhood companion, her master of horse, her mirror in the night. He was beautiful, reckless, and haunted by his own scandals. Rumors clung to them like perfume, whispers of secret meetings, shared chambers, hands that lingered too long. And yet Elizabeth never confirmed, never denied. She danced with him at balls. She laughed at his jokes. She promoted him again and again, and when his wife died under suspicious circumstances, she distanced herself, not with anger, but with sorrow. Even love, she knew, must sometimes be sacrificed to silence. She filled her court with poets and scholars, diplomats and dancers. She wore gowns embroidered with symbols, eyes, alzuns, serpents, virgin goddesses, every thread, a message, every jewel, a warning. She painted her face white with lead, drew her lips in blood-red arcs, and wore wigs like battle helms. Her appearance became armor. Her silence became power. But even as the court glittered, the danger did not vanish. Plots curled through the corridors like smoke. Some came from Spain, enraged by her rejection of their prince. Others from France, fearful of her influence. But the worst, the most intimate, came from within. Catholics who still called her illegitimate, nobles who believed a woman could not rule, Protestants who thought her reforms too gentle. All of them watching, all of them waiting for her to fall. And above them all, a name: Mary, Queen of Scots, a Catholic cousin, a widow of the French king, a queen in her own right, and to many, the true heir to England's throne. She had royal blood, Catholic backing, and the support of those who still mourned Mary Tudor's burning flame. She was young, beautiful, dangerous, and she had come to England. Elizabeth, careful, gracious, and cold, offered her cousin shelter. But she also placed her under guard. The presence of Mary in England was a spark on dry grass. Rebellions flared. Secret letters passed between hands like poison. Plots were uncovered, some real, blank case. Others imagined. And Elizabeth watched them all unfold, knowing that any misstep could drag her back to the tower, back to the scaffold, back to the blade. So she smiled, and she signed warrants, and she waited. Because power was not in the shouting. It was in the silence after. And Elizabeth, daughter of Anne, child of fire and execution, had mastered the silence. There are queens born of power, wrapped in coronation robes, carried to thrones on the shoulders of certainty. And then there are queens born of peril women, who rule not because the path was clear, but because everyone else had already fallen. Elizabeth was the second kind, a queen carved from survival, tempered in fire, and shadowed by ghosts that never quite left her side. Even as she stood in the full glow of her crown, her voice steady, air laws firm, her kingdom rising from the ashes of religious war, she was still, in the quiet of her chambers, the daughter of a dead woman. Anne Boleyn had been gone for more than 2 decades, and yet her absence lingered like perfume on velvet. Elizabeth rarely spoke of her. She never publicly mourned her, and yet, in her private ring, hidden beneath layers of ruby and gold, I was a tiny portrait, 2 faces side by side. Hers and Anne's, no inscription, just a quiet closeness, pressed into metal and worn against her skin for nearly 45 years. She touched it often when alone, when writing letters, when making decisions no man could help her carry. And there were many, because queens, like mothers, are often forced to choose between blood and survival. And Elizabeth, despite her strength, despite her brilliance, was no different. Her cousin, Mary Stuart, Queen of Scots, had become more than a guest, more than a rival, more than a burden. She had become a mirror, a woman crowned by blood, Catholic and proud, once married to the King of France, now widowed, fallen, seeking refuge and claiming, always, that she was the rightful Queen of England. Where Elizabeth had risen through silence, Mary thundered. Where Elizabeth bent like steel, Mary cracked like glass. And each shard was sharp with danger. At first, Elizabeth kept her cousin locked away, not as a punishment, but as a precaution. The mere existence of Mary Stuart gave courage to every plotter, every priest in hiding, every nobleman who longed to see the old religion return. It was not personal. It was political. And yet it became personal, because with each passing year, Mary's presence grew heavier. More spies, more letters, more whispers, more signatures scrawled in code at the bottom of papal plots and French conspiracies. Elizabeth's own spy network, led by the cold and brilliant Sir Francis Walsingham, began intercepting them, decoding them, watching the plans unfold like poison through the ink. The Babington plot. They called it a plan not only to kill Elizabeth, but to replace her with Mary. A coup wrapped in Latin prayers and kissed crucifixes, and at the bottom of one intercepted letter was Mary's own handwriting agreeing to it all. It was the one thing Elizabeth had always prayed she would never see. For nearly 20 years, she had protected Mary, housed her, guarded her, not as a friend, not as a sister, but as someone who could not yet be destroyed. Elizabeth had always known that once she killed a queen, she could never again be only a woman. She would become something else entirely, something the world had never seen before. But the ink was there. The treason was proven. And so, with a shaking hand, Elizabeth signed the death warrant. The axe fell in February of the year 1587. Mary wore red, the color of martyrdom. She walked calmly to the block. Holding a crucifix, she forgave her executioner, and when her head was finally severed from her shoulders, it was discovered that she had hidden her dog beneath her gown, and it refused to leave her side. News of the execution swept through Europe like fire, through dry fields. Catholic kings howled. The Pope condemned her. The Spanish king, Philip II, once a suitor of Elizabeth's, now became her mortal enemy. An armada was prepared, a fleet unlike anything England had ever faced. War loomed on the horizon, heavy as a thunderstorm, and Elizabeth stood alone. She was 55 years old when the ships appeared, sails dark against the gray horizon, and crosses gleaming on canvas. Cannon loaded. The Spanish Armada, 130 vessels, carrying more than 20,000 men, determined to crush her, to reclaim England for the Pope, to drag Elizabeth from her throne and replace her with a Catholic prince. But queens born of peril do not go quietly. Elizabeth rode to Tilbury in armor, on horseback, before her gathered army, her red hair unbound, her voice like steel wrapped in silk. "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman," she said, "but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England, too." And they believed her. Storms came. The English fleet held. The Spanish ships were scattered, burned, broken against rocks and wind and rage. Elizabeth had defied Rome, defied kings, and now she had defied the sea. But victory, as always, came with a cost. Her court changed. Old friends died. Robert Dudley, her most trusted companion, passed away just a year after the Armada's defeat. He left behind a letter she kept in a box by her bed, labeled his last. She would read it in secret, lips trembling, eyes wet. She would never replace him, never name another as close. And though younger men came, Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, bold and beautiful and foolish, none of them lasted. None of them ever quite knew how to love a woman made of steel. She aged in white powder and silence. The red of her hair faded beneath wigs. Her face became a mask of pearl and paint. And yet she ruled, with fire when needed, with mercy when possible, with patience always. She was both shadow and light, storm and shelter, and beneath the layers, the armor, the titles, she remained, the girl who had once watched her mother disappear through a tower door and never return. She would not weep. She would not fall. She would become the mother of a kingdom, the Virgin Queen, the Eternal Queen, the daughter of no one and of everyone. By the time the candles in Elizabeth's chamber began to burn shorter than they once did, she had ruled longer than her father, her brother, and her sister combined. The years had carved their lines into her skin, not gently, but with the same cold precision she had once reserved for her decisions. Her reign, once painted in the golden brushstrokes of triumph, had begun to turn pale with age. But Elizabeth, daughter of the executed queen, survivor of prisons, plots, and plague, would not yield easily to time. She was past 60 when the whispers started again. Whispers not of war, or religion, or marriage, but of death. The courtiers had grown quieter in her presence. They spoke to her as if through glass. Every sentence lacquered with reverence. Every bow held a moment too long. They had begun to remember that she was mortal. And Elizabeth, who had spent her entire reign becoming something more than a woman, did not forgive the reminder. She painted her face thicker. She wore higher collars. She demanded that no mirror be placed before her unless the light was flattering. She danced until her feet bled. She rode until her joints ached. She stood for hours in drafty halls, while foreign ambassadors shivered under her gaze. If her body was failing, she would drag it forward by force of will. She had watched kings die groaning in their beds. She would not be one of them. She would not be seen folding. She would not be caught in the act of fading. And yet she was tired. Robert Dudley was gone. buried beneath Westminster with a tomb she never visited, though she kept his last letter beside her bed until the very end. His stepson, Robert de Vereux, had risen in his place too brash, too proud, too careless with power. She had trusted him, laughed with him, given him command, and he, like so many men before, mistook affection for permission. He led a rebellion. She signed his death warrant with a hand that trembled, and when they brought her word that his head had fallen, she did not speak for a full day. The court understood what that silence meant. One by one, the lights around her began to dim. Poets died. Courtiers aged. Her ladies-in-waiting married or vanished. The great men of her reign, Walsingham, Burghley, Cecil, left empty chairs behind them. The court, once alive with music and color, became a place of echoes. She would walk the gallery and see no faces she remembered. She would sit beneath tapestries that had faded along with her youth, and the people, too, began to look elsewhere. The talk of succession returned. Elizabeth had no heir, no husband, no child. She had spent more than 40 years ruling alone. And now, as the breath grew shorter in her chest, the nobles began to look north to James of Scotland, son of Mary, the queen she had executed. It was a bitter truth that the son of the woman she had signed to death might now inherit everything she had built, but Elizabeth said nothing. She had never ruled for legacy, only for survival, and now even that was slipping from her fingers. In the last months of her life, she would not sleep. She stood for hours, dressed in black, beneath the drafts of Richmond Palace, refusing her bed, refusing food, refusing doctors. When they begged her to lie down, she shook her head. Must, she whispered. Must is not a word to be used to princes. They brought her cushions and laid them on the floor. She sat upon them cross-legged, motionless for days. Her red wigs were removed. Her face, once masked in white, was left bare. Those who saw her said she looked like a candle, burning at both ends, luminous, but nearly gone. No prayers, no tears, no confessions, only silence. She died in the early hours of March the 24th, in the year 1603. At the age of 69, the end came quietly, as if she had simply stopped fighting. There were no final proclamations, no grand speeches, just the sound of rain outside, and the deep exhale of a queen who had ruled alone, who had buried every man she had ever loved, who had built an empire from the ruins of her father's obsession. They placed her beside her sister, Mary, two daughters of Henry, two queens of opposite faiths, now resting beneath the same stone. But it was Elizabeth's name carved in gold, and it was her face the people remembered, not as a woman, not even as a queen, but as something more, something fierce, something final. The Tudor line had begun in war, with a red rose and a sword. It had clawed its way through battles and betrayals, had stitched itself into England with iron and fire, with marriages that fractured empires and children born in the shadow of prophecy. And now, with Elizabeth's last breath, it ended in silence. No child, no heir, no son of Henry to carry forward the crown he had broken his soul trying to secure. The son had died. The daughters had reigned, and the name of Tudor passed away not with screams, but with a sigh. She had ruled for 44 years, longer than any monarch before her. She had never married, never allowed a foreign king to place his hands upon her kingdom. She had danced around courtship like a flame, dancing across oil, beautiful to behold, but never safe to touch. And now that she was gone, all of England seemed to hold its breath, as if unsure whether to mourn her or fear what would come next. The road from Richmond to Westminster was lined with thousands. They stood in silence, heads bowed. As her coffin passed, it was draped in purple velvet and borne by horses that did not stumble. Behind it came riders in black, and behind them, the weight of an entire era. Some cried, some only stared. The children on the roadside had never known another ruler. The old whispered stories of when she was young, when her hair was red and her eyes flashed like a sword drawn at court. But now she was gone, and something older than her had died with her. They buried her in Westminster Abbey. Beneath the inscription, "Here lies Elizabeth, a virgin pure. Here lies the Queen, so wise, so just, so secure." Beside her lay Mary, the sister who had imprisoned her, the woman who had once ordered her death. But in death, all things are softened, and Elizabeth, ever the careful architect of her own myth, had allowed the burial a final act of grace. Or perhaps irony, but if the Tudors had ended, their shadow had not, because everything that came after the pageantry, the empire, the theaters, the revolutions, the colonies bore her mark. She had taken a kingdom, torn by religion, and made it whole. She had ruled not as a wife, not as a mother, but as herself. She had made her body into a symbol, her silence into strength, her solitude into power. And though she left no children, she left a legacy. She left the Royal Navy, built strong enough to withstand storms and armadas. She left Shakespeare, whose pen had found its voice in her reign. She left maps redrawn, coins stamped with her image, and cities that echoed her name. And she left stories. Oh, she left stories of the girl in the tower who would not cry, of the queen in armor before the battle, of the woman who wore her mother's locket. Though no one dared speak Anne's name, she left behind an England that no longer trembled when a king died. A people who no longer believed that only men could rule. A crown that now belonged to legacy, not lineage. When James of Scotland arrived to claim the throne, son of Mary, on the executed queen, he walked into a kingdom not forged by his own hands, but by hers. He inherited a court she had carved from suspicion, ministers she had taught to lie beautifully, nobles she had trained to kneel at a woman's feet. He changed the banners. Yes, he renamed the dynasty. But it was Elizabeth's England he walked into, and in that way, she never left. They still tell her story in whispers, not just in palaces or cathedrals, but in schoolrooms, on stages, in the pages of books she never read but somehow wrote with her life. They speak of her not as a woman, not as a ruler, but as something else entirely, as myth, as shadow, as flame. Because how do you bury someone who was never truly touched? How do you mourn a queen who never belonged to anyone? Elizabeth had said once, long before the end, that she would live and die a virgin, because she was married to England. And she was right. No man ever held her, but an entire kingdom did. And when she died, it felt for a moment as if England itself had lost its heart. But hearts do not vanish. They echo, and hers sharp, quiet, red-haired and laughing, still beats in every place she touched. In the stone of Westminster, in the ink of a poet's pen, in the breath before a nation bows, not to a king, but to a queen who needed no throne to make her immortal,